Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome to yet another Warhammer lore video. Today we will be talking about Sigvald the Magnificent, one of the legendary lords playable in Total War Warhammer. Sigvald is one of those characters that I think was a real missed opportunity for Games Workshop. I wish they had done more with him, because I think he could have been a very interesting character. Unfortunately, he has a somewhat shallow backstory. This guy is the anti-Conrad. In the case of Conrad Curse, he has a really interesting backstory that you can infer a lot of additional information from. You can get a lot of insight into his psyche based upon how he behaves. Sigvald should have been one of those characters, but unfortunately, I think I must sadly disappoint you. Prince Sigvald, as he originally called himself, and still calls himself, by the way, despite the fact that he is no one's prince anymore, having long since murdered his father and therefore becoming de facto king. However, Sigvald feels that the title Prince is more aesthetically pleasing, and he does have a tendency of violently murdering those who disagree with him, so whoever said that violence never solved anything. But we're getting slightly ahead of ourselves. Young Sigvald was a prince of a Norse warlord, who, some say, had taken a bit of a liking to his sister, and so he did what Norse warlords usually do to women that they have a bit of a liking for, and the result of this unholy union was Sigvald. Sigvald was said to be beautiful, even from birth, and anyone who's seen a newborn toddler will attest that no, those creatures are not very pretty, so Sigvald must indeed have been something quite special. He was also born with a strange birthmark on the back of his neck, something that appeared like a horned creature, and in the north, where worshipping demons is quite natural, this obviously marked him out for greatness. As such, his father did everything he could to please the little bastard, because it so happens that most times when somebody's marked out for greatness in the north, they do end up killing everyone around them, which Daddy probably sought to avoid by buying him nice shiny things. Unfortunately for Daddy, Sigvald did not decide to follow someone a little bit more prosaic, like for example Khorne or Nurgle or Tzeentch, but he instead decided to start worshipping Slaanesh. And the problem with Slaaneshi worshippers is that they never really get enough, do they? And Sigvald, after having debauched himself on many fine things, eventually developed a bit of a fondness for human flesh. And, well, even in the deep, cold north, eating other people tend to be frowned upon. Not so much because of the whole eating humans part. In certain parts of Norska, eating people is entirely acceptable. The problem in this case came from the fact that Sigvald had taken a liking to eating Norsemen. And, seeing as everyone around him was a Norse man, well, essentially Sigvald lived in a land of wonderful two-legged turkeys that walked around gobbling at him all day, and the Norsemen did not particularly like the feeling of being viewed as fodder wherever they went. And so, rather naturally, they decided to try and get rid of Sigvald. They threw him out of the village in the middle of winter, which in Norska is pretty much a guaranteed death sentence. However, unfortunately for the Norsemen, Sigvald was not just anybody, and Slaanesh had indeed taken quite a liking to the little boy, and saved him from certain death. This, as you can imagine, had less than ideal consequences for the villagers who had recently thrown him out, as he murdered Daddy and ate pretty much all of them. This garnered him quite the reputation in the North, where, doing shit like this is cause for respect rather than a damn good reason indeed to bludgeon his brains out with blunt instruments. And so Sigvald quite quickly accumulated a bunch of followers, although not quite as quickly as he potentially could have, since he had a nasty habit of stabbing anyone he didn't consider to be attractive enough. He also tended to stab people if they didn't give him enough compliments, or if they smelled bad, if they didn't have the correct sense of humour, e.g. his, if they were wearing some kind of unfashionable clothes that he didn't like. And naturally he stabbed them if they had anything that could in any way be perceived to be more perfect than anything he had. So if they had slightly sparklier eyes, stab. If they had a slightly more chiseled abdomen, stab. if they had slightly curlier hair, stabbed. If they were somehow a little bit more toned, stabbed. And so on, and so on. Sigvald had fairly high standards about who could and could not join his warband, but eventually the warband got big enough to the point where he would simply delegate this to the less pickish underlings at his command. After that, he would just stab random strangers for fun, rather than for work. And of course, being a prince of Slaanesh, he would also often stab things with his slightly more bendier and fleshy sword. But still, the vast majority of the stabbing was done with his legendary sword Silver Slash, which is a remarkably normal-looking sword. For someone of Sigvald's particular interests, I really would have expected him to simply just cover his penis in sheath metal and fight with that instead, and that would have been a lot more amusing, but nevertheless he decided to go the old-fashioned route because he is a hopeless romantic. And speaking of fighting, if the simple fact that he took on an entire village of people and ate the vast majority of them wasn't enough of a giveaway, Sigvald was a pretty damn good fighter. He wasn't just a pretty face. And he was rewarded plenty of times by Slaanesh for his due diligence and devotion to the cause of being an absolutely crazy pervert, giving him incredible strength and incredible speed, as well as superhuman reflexes, and some other slightly less useful, but nonetheless for a Slaanesh champion, extremely worthwhile enchantments. For example, his cloak never gets dirty, nor does his armour. And additionally, said armour allows him to hover just an inch or two above the ground, not for any real strategic purposes, but just so he doesn't get his feet dirty. And you might think that that sounds like a pretty fucking worthless superpower, the ability to not get dirty, and yes, in most cases, I would probably agree. However, this is the Slaaneshi champion we're talking about here, and they consider this very, very important indeed. To illustrate the point, Sigvald once burned down an entire village because he thought their wine tasted a little bit off. He once declared war on an imperial province because he broke a nail on the armor of a warrior priest he was choking to death at the time. In other words, Sigvald is a little bit rash and a little bit petulant in the same way that Niagara Falls is a little bit wet. In fact, you might even go so far as to say that he is just a teensy-weensy bit narcissistic. To the point that, even though he is a pretty damn amazing fighter, he occasionally just simply refuses to fight. Even in the middle of a pitched battle, it was by no means unusual for Sigvald to just simply prance off somewhere and spend his time looking into various mirrors carried by his so-called bodyguards, although they don't do a whole lot of guarding. Sigvald is more than capable of taking care of himself, and indeed he also has the power of regeneration, which allows him to quite easily regenerate any minor injuries that would scar his otherwise perfect physique. So they're pretty much just glorified mirror bearers, but they consider it a great honour, so everything's fine in the world, I suppose. And while I usually don't like to refer to that series of books, there was actually a wonderful example of Sigvald refusing to do battle in that series of books that shall not be mentioned, when Sigvald, along with several other Chaos champions, was summoned to defend Archon from Volton. However, Sigvald decided that he didn't need to fight because he was worthy of fighting Sigmar himself, not some mere godling knockoff version of Sigmar, and so he just sat around on a set of stairs preening his feathers until he finally got his ass whooped by an undead monster by the name of Krell. And while I usually do not give two shits about end times lore, in this case it actually gives Sigvald a halfway decent ending, so why not use it? Krell essentially defeated Sigvald. He had him on his knees in the dirt. However, he'd also scarred Sigvald quite horribly in doing so, and Sigvald managed to catch a glimpse of his own reflection, which pissed him off a lot, until he eventually beat an undead skeleton, encased in chaos armor by the way, to death with his bare fists, which took a bit of a toll on his otherwise pretty manicured fingers. And of course this is where the end times kind of pisses on itself, because as I mentioned already, Sigvald is capable of regeneration, but somehow his scarring and his now mangled arms made him freak out so bad that he didn't notice that another follower of Chaos by the name of Throg was moving up behind him. Unfortunately for Sigvald, Throg had a rather dim view of Sigvald after Sigvald had attempted to stab him for not being pretty enough, and so Throg did the only reasonable thing in such a situation: he bashed Sigvald's skull in and pissed on his corpse. And in all due honesty, that ending might just be good enough to let me ignore the fact that Sigvald somehow forgot about his regenerative powers. Because, in all due honesty, it is just the most perfect way for Sigvald the Magnificent to die, isn't it? To be brained from behind while he was defenseless, weeping over his temporary loss of beauty by some random ugly bastard that then proceeds to piss on him. Honestly though, I think they could have done a little bit more with Sigvald. I would really have liked to see them expand a little bit more on his storyline as the beautiful villain, you know? Showing a little bit of the evil behind the facade. I think they could have made a damn interesting character out of him if he wasn't already a Chaos worshipper. Imagine his fall to Chaos, for example, if he was just an Imperial citizen who got by on his good looks and being handsome, followed by a slow degradation of his moral standards until finally being driven out of the Empire, losing all of the things that allowed him to continue his soft life, and then slowly but surely he would become uglier and uglier in spirit, until finally, once realizing this, he would break in mind and body and give himself willingly to the Chaos Gods. I would have loved a story like that, but unfortunately that was not quite the story we got, although I do like Sigvald just as a character design. I really do. He's doesn't look anything like a Chaos Warrior, yet he's probably one of the most depraved and horrible one of them all. I absolutely adore that part of him. So, while this has been a bit of a shorter video than normal, simply because Sigvald doesn't have that much in the way of lore, unless I go into the Chaos Warrior book about him, which I'm not going to, simply because I do try to avoid spoilers for actual books in this lore series, so until next time, I have been Arch, thank you very much for watching, and I do hope to see you again soon. Have a good day.